Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into ancient Greece, where olive trees whispered in dry summer wind, and one extremely overqualified demigod kept being assigned the worst errands imaginable. We're talking about a man who could bench press a chariot, but somehow couldn't bench press his own tragic life choices. A hero draped in lion skin, haunted by guilt, and sent off to complete what might be history's most chaotic to-do list. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing which corners of the world are awake for mythological mayhem. Now, settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before the labors began, before the lion skin became a fashion statement, and before kings started outsourcing their pest problems to him, Hercules had been born under a sky already tense with divine jealousy. He had been the son of Zeus, who, predictably, could not resist meddling in mortal households, and Alcmene, who had not exactly signed up for Olympian drama. Hera, Zeus's long-suffering wife, had taken one look at the newborn and decided that this baby would be her lifelong nemesis. It was a bold choice, feuding with an infant, but the gods rarely prioritized emotional maturity. Even in the cradle, snakes had slithered toward him at Hera's command, and even then he had crushed them with chubby hands, as if destiny had no patience for warm-up rounds. Strength clung to him like a second skin. Teachers struggled to manage him. One unfortunate music instructor met an abrupt end when discipline went slightly too far. It had not taken much for his temper to ignite, and then, as if divine spite needed a climax, Hera struck him with madness. In a haze he had not chosen, he killed his own wife, Megara, and their children. The horror settled afterward like smoke after a wildfire, suffocating and undeniable. When clarity returned, it brought grief sharp enough to hollow bone. He had not blamed Hera aloud. Accusing a goddess was rarely productive. Instead, he sought purification, stumbling toward Apollo's oracle at Delphi, desperate for some structure to contain his guilt. The Pythia's words had not comforted him. They had instructed him to serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae for 12 years and perform whatever labors the king demanded. Eurystheus, notably, was neither brave nor impressive. He had been small-minded, cautious, and chronically intimidated by the hero he commanded, which made the arrangement feel less like redemption and more like cosmic irony. Thus began the infamous cycle, a broken man with god-tier strength reporting for duty to a nervous bureaucrat with a throne. The labors were framed as atonement, yet they also became spectacle, proof, and punishment all braided together. Each task would scrape against his pride, test his endurance, and expand his legend, though legend had not been what he wanted. He had wanted forgiveness. Instead, he received assignments, and the first of those waited in the hills of Nemea, where something with claws and an ego problem prowled the dark. The hills of Nemea had rolled outward in dry, golden waves, deceptively peaceful, as though nothing larger than a stubborn goat lurked among the rocks. Villagers had spoken in low voices about the lion, a creature whose hide no blade could pierce, whose roar bounced off stone and settled into bone. Sheep vanished, shepherds followed, and the countryside developed that tense, abandoned feel, like everyone had collectively decided to stay indoors and hope the problem solved itself. It did not. When Heracles arrived, carrying weapons forged with every reasonable expectation of usefulness, he discovered almost immediately that reasonable did not apply here. Arrows struck the beast and skittered away as if embarrassed. Bronze bent. The lion, meanwhile, looked personally offended, like someone had just tried to swat it with a napkin. There was a brief, almost comical escalation. More weapons, more failure, more realization dawning that this would not be a neat, heroic archery moment. So he adapted. He blocked the exits of the creature's cave, cornered it within the cramped darkness, and did what myth insists only he could do. He grappled it barehanded. The struggle churned dust into choking clouds. Claws scraped stone. Breath came hot and ragged. Strength met strength, and for once, the invulnerable met something stronger. He locked his arms around its throat and did not let go. When the lion finally fell still, silence rushed in, heavy and almost reverent. The victory was not elegant. It was brutal, intimate, exhausting. And then came the practical dilemma. How did one skin an animal immune to blades? The answer was annoyingly poetic. He used the lion's own claw, slicing through its hide with the very instrument that had made it untouchable. There was something fitting in that, something almost smug. He draped the pelt over his shoulders, the golden mane falling around his face, transforming him into a silhouette people would recognize for centuries. The hide was more than armor. It was proof. Eurystheus, upon seeing him return alive, and worse, triumphant, reportedly panicked enough to hide inside a storage jar. It set a tone. The king would issue commands from a safe distance. The hero would handle the unsanitary details. But relief was brief. Success did not shorten the sentence. Instead, it confirmed that he was capable of surviving whatever absurdity came next. And next arrived with multiple heads, venomous blood, and a tendency to regrow what was severed, because apparently one nightmare per week was not ambitious enough. The road turned toward Lerna, where marsh water stagnated under a watchful sky, and something ancient waited with patience and too many necks. The marshes of Lerna had not been inviting. They simmered under a sour haze, reeds whispering in the kind of way that made normal people turn around and reconsider their life trajectory. Beneath that damp quiet lurked the Hydra, a serpent with multiple heads. Sources disagreed on the exact number, which felt on brand for a creature that kept changing the count mid-fight. One head, however, was immortal, because of course it was. When Hercules stepped into the sucking mud, he did not receive a heroic soundtrack. He received fumes and the unsettling knowledge that cutting one head off would only produce two more, like some cursed mathematical joke. The first strike confirmed it. A head fell, thrashed, and from the stump burst two replacements, snapping with fresh enthusiasm. It was less valiant combat and more gardening gone terribly wrong. He could have kept swinging indefinitely, creating a hydra bouquet, but even he recognized that this was not sustainable. Adaptation, again, became the real weapon. He called upon his nephew Iolaus, who waited nearby with a torch, probably wondering how his day had spiraled into assisting demigod pest control. Each time Hercules severed a head, Iolaus cauterized the stump with fire, sealing it before duplication could occur. It was methodical, smoky work. Slice, burn, recoil, repeat. The creature writhed, its blood hissing against flame, venom spattering onto soil that would remain poisonous long after. At one point, a massive crab, sent naturally by Hera, because subtlety was not her style, scuttled in to clamp onto Heracles' foot. He crushed it without ceremony. The Hydra weakened head by head until only the immortal one remained, hissing with an indignation that suggested it had never considered losing. Unable to kill it outright, he severed that final head and buried it beneath a heavy rock, as if pressing pause on something that refused to end. The carcass lay coiled and steaming. Then, in a gesture equal parts pragmatic and ominous, he dipped his arrows into the Hydra's venom. From that moment forward, even a scratch from his bow would carry lethal consequence. It was the kind of upgrade one did not advertise casually. When he returned, Eurystheus attempted to disqualify the labor, arguing that assistance from Iolaus voided the purity of the task. It was a convenient technicality from someone who had not been ankle-deep in toxic sludge. Still, the king counted it, albeit grudgingly, and immediately searched for the next ordeal. Word spread of the Hydra's fall, but admiration did not erase the pattern forming beneath it all. Every solution demanded ingenuity beyond brute force. Muscles alone were insufficient. The next challenge would not roar or writhe, it would flee, swift as wind and crowned in gold, leading him far from swamps into the cold, thin air of Arcadian highlands. The Cyrenaean hind, a deer so fast it practically mocked the concept of catching, pranced across the hills of Arcadia like it owned the place, which technically it did, being sacred to Artemis and all. Hercules had been tasked with capturing it alive, a request that would have annoyed any sane hunter, because there's a point where speed meets divinity and suddenly nothing makes sense. The creature's golden antlers shimmered under sunlight, as if it had been photoshopped by the gods themselves, and its hooves barely touched the ground, leaving mere whispers of footprints in dry grass. Hours melted into days as he pursued it, each sprint more humiliating than the last, because running fast is one thing, but outrunning a mythological deer that actively sidestepped your strategy requires patience most mortals didn't have. At some point, he realized that brute force alone would not suffice. Catching it demanded subtlety, a concept Hercules respected in theory but rarely practiced. He observed the hind's patterns, noted its grazing and rest cycles, and even considered a diversion using scent or noise, because apparently stalking deer in ancient Greece required a level of tactical planning that might give modern hunters existential dread. The moment of truth came when, after exhausting every chase tactic short of begging, he finally cornered it near a quiet stream, balancing between caution and reverence. Artemis had eyes everywhere, and no one wanted a deity throwing a cosmic hissy fit, using gentle restraint and the slow, deliberate patience he had learned from experience, and begrudgingly admitting that sometimes brains beat brawn, he captured the hind without harming it. The creature, surprisingly compliant, once properly contained, seemed to grant a grudging respect for the mortal who could match its speed and wit, though whether it actually felt that way is up for debate. When he delivered it to Eurystheus, the king nearly fainted from disbelief, simultaneously terrified that he now possessed something sacred, and smugly glad he didn't have to chase it himself. But the labor, like all the previous ones, was merely a prelude. Success was fleeting. Just as Nemea and Lerna had set expectations, so too did the hind foreshadow that triumph often came with strings, divine or otherwise. Each conquest expanded Heracles' reputation and notoriety, but it also tightened the chain of obligations that bound him to tasks that escalated in absurdity, cruelty, or outright lunacy. As he left Arcadia, the air crisp and pine-scented, he couldn't yet foresee that his next challenge would take him to the stables of King Augeas, a man so wealthy and lazy that centuries later philosophers would mock him as the epitome of sloth, while Heracles would wade ankle-deep in filth that made even Hydra sludge look polite. The chase of something sacred had taught him patience and ingenuity, but the upcoming labor would test his endurance, creativity, and, most inconveniently, his sense of smell. The stables of Augeas were exactly as repulsive as rumors suggested, and slightly worse, which in Heracles' experience always seemed to be the case. The king had managed to amass thousands of cattle over decades without ever cleaning a single stall, apparently believing that manure had aesthetic or symbolic value. Aristotle would have disagreed, and frankly, so would anyone with functioning nostrils. Heracles arrived with the sort of resigned determination reserved for people who realized that task of the day might also double as test of humanity's patience. He had been ordered to clean the stables in a single day, an expectation so absurd that one had to admire Eurystheus's gall or his ignorance. The odor hit first, a noxious wave of ammonia, dung, and ancient decay that could strip paint off a wall, and Heracles, though impervious to many things, acknowledged it silently as a legitimate opponent. He quickly discarded the notion of manual labor. Shoveling by hand would have consumed weeks and probably caused minor existential collapse. Instead, he employed a stroke of genius, or sheer impatience with conventional solutions, and rerouted 2 rivers to flow through the stables, washing the filth away with relentless force. Water gushed, manure surrendered, and Augeas' wealth remained mostly intact, although the palace staff likely considered quitting on the spot. Eurystheus, predictably, attempted to disqualify the labor, claiming that Heracles had bent the rules because technically using rivers wasn't in the original job description. Heracles' reaction was a silent glare, an expression that could strip paint off walls more effectively than Augeas' own stables. Despite bureaucratic whining, the labor counted, and the hero added yet another impossible task to his growing resume, a resume that screamed, "I can do anything, you small-minded mortals." But the cleaning, absurd as it was, left him contemplating the nature of reward versus effort. Each labor became less about atonement and more about demonstrating the grotesque extent of his capabilities, a point made sharper by Eurystheus' constant cowering and petty oversight. Leaving the stables behind, Heracles moved on to a task that involved birds, yes, birds, whose appetite for human flesh and bronze feathers made them the kind of creatures that could turn an ordinary lunch break into a survival horror episode. The stables had tested ingenuity and brute force. The upcoming challenge would test reflexes, patience, and an almost cruel tolerance for ridiculousness in a way that left the mind questioning the god's sense of humor. By now, Heracles had grown accustomed to absurdity, yet he couldn't help but notice that each labor, while ostensibly punishment or penance, doubled as a masterclass in escalating nonsense. What followed next would not involve mud, rivers, or venomous serpents, but an aviary nightmare that would make anyone reconsider the appeal of mythological heroism. The Stymphalian birds were exactly the kind of overachieving nightmares that made you question why the gods even bothered with mortal heroes, giant, man-eating birds with bronze beaks and metallic feathers sharp enough to pierce armor, who had apparently taken up residency in a marsh just to be annoying. Their presence had turned the countryside into a war zone of feathers, screams, and occasional human casualties, because of course mere scale wasn't enough. They needed flair. Heracles approached cautiously, though caution here was mostly an aesthetic choice. He had learned by now that stealth could only get you so far when your target was airborne, fast, and weaponized by divine design. He tried shouting, waving, even the occasional attempt at diplomacy, but the birds seemed to regard him as a particularly slow snack. Inspiration, or divine luck, arrived via Athena, who supplied him with a pair of bronze crotala, basically ancient castanets, which, when clanged together, produced a sound so obnoxious it could unsettle avian senses, and possibly small children too. Heracles clanged, stomped, and waved, driving the birds into the sky in a flurry of metallic wings and screeches, a sort of chaotic orchestra of panic. With patience, timing, and an admittedly epic display of upper body strength, he picked them off mid-flight with arrows dipped in hydra venom. a trick that added lethal efficiency to his aesthetic of controlled chaos. The marsh echoed with clang, screech, and the occasional splash as one too ambitious bird misjudged its trajectory. When the last one fell or scattered, Hercules surveyed the carnage with a mix of pride and mild disgust. The feathers clung to everything, the mud was worse than Augeia's stables, and yet victory felt almost hollow because the birds had been small, tangible foes compared to what lay ahead. Each labor seemed to escalate not just in difficulty, but in sheer absurdity, a cosmic joke where Heracles was the punchline who also had to win. He returned to Eurystheus, who, predictably, tried to wiggle out of acknowledging that this was a legitimate success, whining that technically some birds flew away. Heracles' patience for technicalities was thinning. He had faced snakes, hydras, immortal heads, sacred deer, rivers of filth, and now airborne death machines, and still had to pretend he cared about petty bureaucracy. This labor, while seemingly a side quest in the grand narrative of his penance, had subtly prepared him for the challenges where size, divine protection, and strategy collided, challenges that would test not just strength, but diplomacy, endurance, and the ability to wrestle logic into submission. From the Stymphalian marsh, the road stretched toward Crete, where a bull awaited, embodying raw power and temper in a way that made previous labors feel like warm-ups. The pattern was clear, each task built on the last, shaping a hero who was less mortal than mythic and more exasperated than honored. The Cretan bull was exactly the kind of problem that made people wish Mythology had a customer service line, preferably staffed by someone with patience and a sense of smell strong enough to survive stables. But no, it fell squarely on Heracles' shoulders. This bull had been wreaking havoc across the island, trampling crops, scaring villagers, and generally doing what any untamed animal with a divine origin would do, act like it owned the place, which, technically, it kind of did. Heracles tracked the creature across rocky hills and sun-baked plains, the ground trembling beneath its hooves, a living earthquake that had no concept of social etiquette. Weapons were useless, because stabbing a bull doesn't exactly make it reconsider its life choices, and Heracles' patience for brute force debate with large animals was wearing thin. He realized early that the only viable approach was grappling it, because of course, the solution to nearly every mythological labor was hug it really hard until it gives up. There was a brief, cinematic struggle, dust clouds, pawing hooves, low roars that shook the air, and Heracles straining with muscles that might have made modern bodybuilders cry in envy. Eventually, he subdued it, slinging the bull over his shoulders and walking it back to Eurystheus with the kind of casual flex that screamed, "Yeah, I did this, and yes, it was hard. Deal with it." The king, ever the coward, hid, muttering about why he couldn't just stick to organizing sandals or paperwork instead of receiving rampaging bulls. But Heracles' day was far from over. The bull wasn't just a delivery project. Its temperament had to be managed, its energy controlled, and its journey, essentially a heavy, horned Uber ride, required a level of stamina that could make mere mortals pass out on the spot. When he finally presented it, the king tried to disqualify the labor, claiming he hadn't asked for a live model, but merely control it somehow, which is a take that only works if one ignores common sense entirely. Still, the feat counted, and Heracles' reputation continued its inevitable, unstoppable climb. This success, brutal and sweaty as it was, set the stage for a labor that combined domestic inconvenience with wild unpredictability, the man-eating mares of Diomedes. Unlike the bull, which was straightforwardly destructive, these horses were twisted, cruel, and fed on human flesh, proving that the gods' sense of escalation had a particularly dark streak. The bull's capture had been raw power. The next task required cunning, speed, and a slightly sociopathic streak to navigate both animal instinct and mortal horror. Hercules, weary but undeterred, marched toward Thrace, each step a prelude to chaos, fully aware that whatever came next would not care about exhaustion, reason, or dignity. The mares of Diomedes were frankly a nightmare on four legs, each one bred from cruelty and fed on human flesh until manners and morality were optional. Thrace, their home, reeked of iron, sweat, and old blood, a combination that could make a mere mortal pass out in the first 5 minutes. Heracles approached carefully, though carefully here meant observing the beasts while preparing to either run or kill, depending on how polite they felt that day. The horses stamped and snorted, hooves striking the rocky terrain, eyes glinting with the kind of intelligence that whispered, "Yes, I know I'm terrifying, and yes, I enjoy it." Simply riding them wasn't an option. This was a choreographed disaster waiting to happen. Heracles decided that brute force alone wouldn't cut it, though, naturally, muscle still played a starring role. He seized them, using chains strong enough to withstand their strength, but he realized quickly that containment wasn't enough. These horses needed retribution. In a strategic, morally flexible move, he fed Diomedes himself to his own animals, a choice that combined justice, practicality, and the kind of grim humor that mythology occasionally allowed. The horses, satisfied and somewhat mollified, were calmer afterward, proving that cruelty rewarded with cruelty worked remarkably well in myth. Transporting them back to Eurystheus was an ordeal in itself. Thrashing, stamping, and occasionally snapping, these creatures were living proof that domestic labor could be more hazardous than fighting hydras or wrestling bulls. Villagers watched with wide eyes and a mix of terror and awe, whispering to themselves about the demigod who could chain death incarnate and still walk upright afterward. Eurystheus, predictably, retreated to his usual hiding spot, muttering about the impossibility of rewarding such work without looking cowardly or foolish. Heracles, tired but unbowed, had begun noticing a pattern. The labors were increasingly absurd, combining raw strength, creative problem-solving, and moral ambiguity in a way that ensured no one outside Olympus would ever truly understand what counted as heroic. As he left Thrace, the wind smelled faintly of iron and burned hay, a reminder that some deeds left more than stories. They left scars, odors, and reputations that refused to fade. Ahead lay the capture of the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, a task that would test diplomacy in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of subtlety. Muscle alone could not negotiate royalty or charm warriors, and Heracles was about to learn that some assignments required wit sharper than any blade he had carried thus far. The path from Thrace to the lands of the Amazons would demand not just endurance, but an understanding that heroism sometimes meant talking your way through chaos rather than smashing it to pieces. Hippolyta's kingdom sprawled across the edge of the known world, a place of dense forests, jagged cliffs, and warriors who treated hospitality like a test of patience and diplomacy like a sport. Heracles, expecting battle, found himself initially greeted with cautious respect rather than immediate hostility, a detail that gave him pause. Amazons did not do casual handshakes. Hippolyta, queen of the warriors, possessed a presence that could make mountains seem timid, her golden girdle a symbol of authority and strength, and her eyes sharp enough to pierce pretense and insincerity alike. Heracles, armed with a combination of charm, swagger, and the subtle hint of divine intimidation, approached negotiations carefully. For a fleeting moment, diplomacy worked. Hippolyta agreed to part with her girdle, trusting that a direct confrontation was unnecessary. But of course, the gods could not resist stirring the pot. Hera, sneaky as ever, spread rumors among the Amazons that Heracles intended to abduct their queen, turning a simple exchange into chaos. The situation spiraled quickly, with warriors brandishing weapons and a tense standoff that might have been a medieval version of traffic rage, but with more spears and fewer insurance claims. Heracles, ever adaptive, leveraged both his reputation and sheer physical presence to calm tensions, retrieving the girdle while keeping casualties minimal, though pride, tempers, and bruised egos were unavoidable. By the time he departed, the queen had regained composure, the girdle in his possession, and a silent acknowledgement that sometimes mortals, when backed by gods, could bend circumstance to their will without outright violence, though often by inches, and negotiation sharpened with a side of threat. Returning to Eurystheus, the hero added yet another trophy of resourcefulness and social navigation to his increasingly ludicrous resume. The king, watching with the same combination of awe and cowardly disbelief that had become standard. Yet even this labor, a lesson in diplomacy and subtle coercion, prepared him for encounters where cunning and endurance would intersect with the grotesque, as in the case of Geryon's cattle, far to the west, on lands where the sun baked everything to a stubborn, relentless gold. There, the next challenge awaited, combining distance, monsters, and the kind of logistical nightmare that made even experienced mortals reconsider their career choices. Heracles' path now extended beyond simple heroics. It demanded stamina that could rival nature itself, mental endurance against trickery and terrain, and a willingness to confront the absurdities of a world in which gods treated human effort as a testing ground for cosmic amusement. Every step from the Amazon lands westward was a lesson in calculated risk, preparation, and the grim understanding that heroism came with absurd levels of expectation, yet little sympathy from the authorities issuing the tasks. Geryon's cattle grazed on a sun-scorched plain at the western edge of the known world, the kind of place where heat shimmered off the ground like a cruel mirage, and dust coated everything with an oppressive, itchy layer. Heracles arrived, aware that the task demanded more than sheer strength. He had to cross deserts, mountains, and rivers, carrying patience like an extra weapon, because Geryon wasn't just a guy with cows. No, he was a three-bodied, strong-armed nightmare, each torso apparently functioning independently, yet unified in a single, terrifying coordination. The moment Heracles approached, the air thickened with tension, and the cattle stamped nervously, as if they knew their owners could literally double-fist punch anyone foolish enough to step into range. Heracles, ever the pragmatist, sized up the situation. Direct combat might be impressive, but exhaustion and injury would ruin the efficiency of cattle capture. Instead, he executed a combination of brute intimidation and precise timing, targeting the one torso at a time, exploiting moments of overconfidence, and using the terrain to his advantage. Rocks became shields, dust clouds became distractions, and when fists met muscle, the land trembled in response. Geryon roared, three voices at once, a sound so unnerving it could have convinced lesser mortals to dig a hole and hide forever. Yet Heracles remained methodical, adapting with every unexpected strike. After a grueling struggle that tested stamina, strategy, and tolerance for absurdity, Geryon lay subdued, his cattle corralled under careful supervision. Transporting them back was another ordeal. The herd was temperamental, the sun unrelenting, and Heracles' energy reserves stretched thin. But if mythology had taught him anything, it was that whining rarely worked. By the time he delivered the cattle to Eurystheus, The king's disbelief had shifted to cautious respect, though fear remained, a permanent side effect of watching someone haul a three-bodied brute across continents. The labor reinforced a grim truth. Even when strength sufficed, endurance, planning, and a touch of improvisation determined success. Yet the next assignment would escalate in a different, almost personal way, challenging not muscle or strategy, but moral fortitude. Apples of the Hesperides awaited, a task layered in trickery, divine oversight, and a labyrinthine sense of obligation that would confound any ordinary hero. Hercules, having conquered desert, mountain, and absurdly multi-bodied opposition, now faced an assignment that required subtlety, cunning, and the patience to negotiate with immortals whose rules made mortal logic feel quaint and quaintly inadequate. The path to the garden, guarded by nymphs and a dragon, hinted at challenges where knowledge, not just strength, would determine survival and success. Each step into this mythic West was less a straight line than a web of obligations, opportunities, and absurd tests of resolve designed to stretch the concept of hero beyond conventional limits. The Garden of the Hesperides sprawled like a dream painted by a slightly sadistic god, golden apples glinting under a sun that seemed to take perverse joy in highlighting both their beauty and their inaccessibility. Heracles approached with a mixture of awe and mild irritation, because honestly, after lions, hydras, bulls, and three-bodied cowboys, the idea that he had to figure out how to get some fruit without dying felt almost comically petty. The garden was guarded, naturally, by the Hesperides themselves, nymphs with sharp eyes, sharper wit, and a smug sense of territorial entitlement that made negotiation feel like trying to reason with a particularly sassy windstorm. And then, just for spice, a dragon named Ladon coiled among the branches, its scales glittering like malicious jewelry, eyes glinting with eternal suspicion. Heracles had options: fight, sneak, or improvise. And being Heracles, he chose a bit of all three, leaning heavily on improvisation because this was not a creature you could just punch into submission. He attempted diplomacy first, explaining, more or less, that he was on assignment and would only borrow the apples, not steal them permanently, which the Hesperides found hilarious in that "I'm going to burn your soul if you try" sense. When words failed, as they inevitably did, he resorted to more direct methods: wrestling, distraction, and a touch of divine cunning, including enlisting Atlas to retrieve the apples while he briefly held up the sky. Yes, again, Atlas, because the world apparently doubles as a task board for heroic babysitting. The dragon, sensing both patience and audacity, eventually allowed him to leave with the prize, either out of respect, confusion, or sheer boredom. Ancient dragons are notoriously hard to read. Carrying the apples back required vigilance because Hesperides and dragon alike had a vested interest in reclaiming them, and Eurystheus, predictably, had not evolved a single ounce of courage to see it delivered in person. This labor, unlike the others, tested diplomacy, negotiation, and endurance in a way that brute strength alone could not solve. Heracles, having learned through years of progressively insane assignments, adapted seamlessly, combining smarts, improvisation, and moral flexibility to meet objectives set by petty and scheming deities. The experience emphasized that heroism in Greek myth wasn't simply about showing up with muscles. It was about navigating chaos, understanding the rules of divine interference, and exploiting every advantage, even if it meant temporarily babysitting the sky or negotiating with immortal beings prone to melodrama. With the apples secured, the final labor awaited: Cerberus, the three-headed hound of the underworld, a creature whose bark and bite were legendary, and whose temperament suggested that even death itself had rules it might violate if provoked. The journey from golden fruits to the gates of Hades would demand not only physical prowess, but courage on a scale that made every previous absurdity look like warm-up stretches. The descent into the underworld was less a stroll and more a negotiation with existential dread. As Hercules crossed rivers thick with murky reflections, shadows whispering in ways that made sanity optional, and the occasional lost soul waving plaintively like someone who realized too late that immortality wasn't all it was cracked up to be, Cerberus waited at the threshold, a three-headed nightmare of teeth, muscle, and attitude, each head snarling in slightly different keys as though competing for attention while simultaneously judging Heracles' life choices. Approaching required a careful balance of strength, respect, and sheer audacity. One misstep, and he could have been mauled, spat upon, or used as a snack, which would have been both inconvenient and karmically ironic. Drawing on every lesson from lions, hydras, bulls, and birds, he moved with a mix of strategy and brute force, calming the beast as much as possible without offending its sense of territorial pride. Arms wrapped around the massive necks, muscles screaming in protest, he wrestled Cerberus into submission, not with violence that would provoke death itself, but with dominance tempered by cunning, a handshake in muscle and teeth that said, "We understand each other, now let's go." The hound, surprisingly compliant once properly restrained, allowed him to escort it to Eurystheus, completing the final labor with the same blend of exasperation and competence that had marked every previous task. The king, hiding in his usual spot behind jars and fragile dignity, could only gape in awe and terror as the three-headed beast was returned alive, proof of Heracles' unmatched capability and the kind of logistical nightmare no mortal bureaucracy should ever attempt. With Cerberus secured, the 12 labors concluded, leaving Heracles not only cleansed of past guilt, but transformed into a figure whose name would echo through time as the embodiment of resilience, ingenuity, and exasperated heroism. Yet even as the tasks ended, the story of Heracles remained one of contradictions. Strength married to moral ambiguity, ingenuity tempered by divine interference, and triumph perpetually shadowed by the absurdity of expectations laid by gods and kings alike. From lions immune to weapons, to serpents with regenerative heads, to divine gardens and the gates of the underworld, his journey had tested every conceivable facet of human and superhuman capacity, each labor escalating the stakes and absurdity in a world where logic bent under divine whim. History would remember him for feats, yes, but also for enduring relentless nonsense with grim persistence and a grimacing charm that somehow made even the most impossible tasks feel like a narrative worth recounting. And so, Heracles' 12 labors became more than chores. They were a saga of suffering, ingenuity, and awkward heroism, a series of escalating challenges that defined what it meant to be a demigod in a universe that combined cruelty, cosmic irony, and occasional begrudging respect for sheer audacity. In the end, he survived, he triumphed, and he left a legacy so absurdly impossible that even gods and mortals alike would forever debate how much was luck, how much was muscle, and how much was sheer, unhinged persistence. Back in the medieval waters, piracy wasn't this edgy lifestyle brand it's made out to be. It was more like a desperate side hustle for people who woke up one day and decided, yeah, taxes are dumb, and boats look fun. Pirates were basically freelance entrepreneurs who forgot the entrepreneur part, selling nothing but chaos and stealing everything they could fit on a creaky deck. They didn't have HR policies, corporate retreats, or even decent dental plans, but somehow they were feared across coastlines, and not because of their charm, more because of sheer unpredictability and the fact that a sword beats common sense every time. Early pirate crews had this hilarious mixture of skill and utter incompetence, like a medieval version of a reality show where everyone's trying to outscam each other while still not knowing how to tie knots properly. Coastal towns learned quickly that walls, gates, and whatever shoddy militia they could cobble together were basically suggestions, not deterrents, because pirates had a stubborn way of thinking that no plan was the superior plan. Some historians, if you squint, describe the first raids as more opportunistic loitering than organized crime, but the people on the receiving end didn't exactly file Yelp reviews. They screamed and ran, which is basically the same as a bad review in historical terms. And yes, it wasn't just men. Rumors and records hint at women occasionally joining these ventures, probably because someone had to handle the map while everyone else was screaming or stabbing, which was the medieval multitasking flex. Supplies were laughably low. Pirates often survived on whatever they could scavenge mid-raid, and the occasional barrel of water that smelled like it had seen 3 wars before their arrival, but morale was weirdly high, fueled by ego, fear, and probably bad fermented drinks. Imagine signing up for a life where your main job description is run, steal, and maybe die in confusing circumstances, and then calling it a career path. And yet, despite all this absurdity, some pirates became semi-famous, not because they were smart, but because they were consistent. Like, if your thing is terrorizing ships for a decade and somehow you survive, congratulations. You're basically the LinkedIn influencer of medieval crime. There was a rhythm to the madness. Raiding schedules depended on weather, tide, mood swings, and the occasional prophetic goat, if someone thought that was a good idea. Local legends sometimes describe the first pirate attacks as almost theatrical, like someone decided the coastline needed a bit of surprise drama, and everyone else had to improvise. There were moments of sheer brilliance, like sneaking up on trade ships, but mostly it was screaming, splintered wood, and everyone questioning life choices. And yet, society had this weird respect-horror mix for these freelance sea bandits, probably because it's easier to fear chaos than to fix systemic boredom on land. It was messy, it was ridiculous, and it worked, at least until someone built a slightly sturdier wall. Medieval piracy, in its rawest form, was basically humans on water, realizing that bureaucracy hadn't caught up to the idea of sheer audacity, and using that to their chaotic advantage. Ships in the medieval era were basically giant floating disasters with sails instead of instructions. And somehow, captains were expected to know what they were doing, which is adorable if you ignore the occasional tragic splintering incident. These wooden contraptions could barely handle a decent storm, let alone a crew hopped up on whatever fermented drinks passed for morale boosters. Yet somehow, pirates treated them like luxury apartments on water, complete with the occasional sword fight in the galley. Navigation was a wild mix of stars, guesswork, and shouting at anyone who tried to correct you, which meant that a strategic retreat often looked more like a desperate wandering into a cliff or sandbar, punctuated by existential panic. Some captains were surprisingly competent, actually, able to ram, board, and occasionally sink enemy vessels while still keeping their crew from mutiny. Though, honestly, mutiny was usually just a slower version of chaos, like a low-budget sequel to their standard raids. Ship maintenance was a comedy show on its own. Crews patched holes with random planks, nails that didn't fit, and more optimism than actual craftsmanship, leading to the charmingly inevitable moment when a ship would start leaking mid-battle, and everyone collectively shrugged. Then there were the ships themselves, which ranged from tiny rowboats pretending to be frigates to lumbering cargo haulers that creaked ominously with every wave. But in pirate hands, any vessel became a potential terror machine, if terror is defined as terribly unpredictable but occasionally effective. Some captains fancied themselves tacticians, planning maneuvers that looked like someone had spilled ink on a map. But luck was as crucial as skill, and often more reliable, because the universe clearly enjoyed seeing humans overestimate their nautical genius. Interestingly, pirates had little patience for pomp or decorum on deck. A fancy ship meant nothing if it couldn't outrun someone slightly hungover or sink an enemy with as little coordination as possible. This combination of low-tech engineering, questionable leadership, and stubborn confidence created moments of pure absurdity. A captain would bark orders, half the crew would misunderstand, the other half would mutter darkly about the food, and somehow, sometimes, a ship would reach its target, proving that chaos occasionally has a method. And don't forget the environmental hazards, storms, reefs, rogue currents, and occasionally jealous sea creatures, all of which reminded pirates that arrogance might be their default setting, but humility arrives quickly in 12-foot waves. Sailors learned the hard way that being good at swearing was almost as valuable as knowing how to handle a mast, and captains rewarded clever insults almost as much as tactical success. So yes, ships were dumb, captains were sometimes dumber, and the ocean had no chill. But in this precarious balance, medieval pirates somehow thrived, leaning on luck, audacity, and a truly remarkable ability to ignore danger until it was too late to do anything but panic spectacularly. Every voyage was part disaster movie, part comedy special, and part how did we survive this again story, setting the tone for decades of chaotic maritime legend. Medieval pirates treated looting like it was an eternal Black Friday, and the villages on the receiving end were the poor souls stuck in a never-ending line, except instead of discounted toasters, it was chickens, grain, and occasionally someone's dignity. The concept of chill did not exist in their dictionary. Pirates had zero interest in subtlety, diplomacy, or respecting personal property, which made every raid a high-stakes theater of screaming, running, and please don't kill me gestures that were mostly ignored. They struck when least expected, sometimes at dawn, sometimes under the cover of fog, because timing was basically a suggestion and chaos was non-negotiable. Merchants' convoys learned that caravans on water were like candy stores with lasers, tempting, chaotic, and slightly lethal, so they tried to hire armed escorts, which sometimes helped and sometimes just gave the pirates more people to push off the boat. Looting wasn't just about stealing, it was psychological warfare. Pirates delighted in showing off their haul, tossing stolen goods around, or mocking villagers with exaggerated gestures of thanks for your generosity, which might have been funny if you weren't the one losing your goat. There was a weird sense of pride in their work, like, look at how efficiently we destroyed your economic stability today, combined with the casual swagger of people who had zero concept of sustainable ethics. Sometimes pirates would just wander into a town and casually take what they wanted while chatting with bewildered locals, because for them, life was absurd, and the ocean had taught them that fear is currency. Villages adapted in ridiculous ways. Some built hidden caches, secret escape tunnels, or even trained animals to sound alarms, which led to the occasional goat stampede that terrified everyone, pirate included. It was a cycle of chaos that basically said, you try to defend, we adapt, you fail, repeat. And somehow it worked for centuries. Coastal communities were left traumatized, yet medieval record keepers wrote about these raids with a tone that suggested admiration for creativity, ignoring the fact that the creativity mostly involved stealing, arson, and yelling really loudly. Pirates didn't discriminate much either. Rich or poor, local or foreign, everything was fair game, as long as it floated or could fit in a sack. And then there was the accidental comedy of it all. A pirate captain could be giving a rousing speech about honor among thieves while his crew tripped over barrels, argued over spoils, or fell into the harbor. Stories of daring escapes and clever diversions spread faster than the actual loot, creating myths that made pirates sound smarter than they often were, which is like giving someone a gold star for barely surviving. Yet, for all the chaos, this was how medieval maritime life functioned. Villages nervously rebuilt, pirates bragged about their latest score, and historians later shook their heads, trying to figure out if this was criminal genius or pure luck, while the ocean silently judged everyone equally. Medieval looting, in the end, wasn't elegant, strategic, or even particularly moral. It was loud, messy, and absurdly effective, a masterclass in making every small town question the life choices that led them to a coastline in range of someone else's terrible decisions. Pirates' fashion choices were basically survival hacks that somehow became iconic. And yes, the eye patch was a thing, not just a cool accessory for Halloween enthusiasts centuries later. Losing an eye was often accidental. Swords, splinters, and wildly misjudged cannon fire. But instead of crying into their rum, some clever soul realized, hey, patch it up, look intimidating, profit. Bandanas, torn shirts, and mismatched boots weren't stylistic statements so much as practical improvisations. Keep the sun out, mop up blood, and hope your shoes stay on in the chaos of boarding another ship. Hats were optional, but coveted. They kept your head warm, protected from the sun, and offered excellent hiding spots for pigeons if one happened to be on board. Because yes, pirates sometimes collected birds, probably as a side hobby. Jewelry was a mix of plunder and braggadocio, shiny coins, necklaces, and rings that clinked annoyingly when you ran across a deck, but screamed wealth and dominance, which is basically medieval flex culture. Tattoos existed too, though often rudimentary and painful. Pirates loved a good skull or anchor because nothing says, I'm terrifying and also regretting this, like permanent ink applied with questionable hygiene. The overall vibe was a chaotic but surprisingly cohesive mix of function and intimidation. And somehow the world decided this accidental ensemble was pirate chic, ignoring the fact that it smelled terrible and rarely matched. Hair was another story. Long, greasy, often braided to keep it out of swords' way, or just left to flow dramatically in the wind for morale purposes, because if you're about to plunder a town, nothing says courage like a good hair flip. And yes, some crews adopted the terrifyingly practical strategy of dyeing hair or beards with soot or berries to look scarier. Apparently, it worked because opposing forces occasionally surrendered just from horror at the fashion choices. The infamous hook hand was another combination of accident and ingenuity, which, unlike modern prosthetics, did not restore function, but did provide excellent intimidation and occasional comedic moments when the pirate tried to open a door or lift a barrel. Gloves, belts, and sashes carried tools, knives, or lucky charms because pirates were emotionally attached to random objects more than organizational logic. The aesthetic ended up being a wild balance between necessity, accident, and what one might call pirate ego flair, resulting in a look that screamed, I don't care, I'm here to take your stuff and probably offend your ancestors. Villagers and enemies often judged entire crews by appearance alone, which was both hilarious and tragic, because sometimes the most terrifying looking pirate was the least competent, and the least terrifying one managed to steal everything in sight. By the time the 16th century rolled around, all of these fashion choices were codified into the myths we know today, but originally they were just creative adaptations to a life that involved too much sun, too little hygiene, and a shocking amount of accidental violence. In the end, pirates taught the world a valuable lesson. If you survive long enough, whatever you wear, you can make it legendary, even if it's because of a missing eye or a bird on your shoulder. Rum, revenge, and really bad planning were basically the holy trinity of medieval pirate logic, and honestly, it's impressive how they survived as long as they did, considering their decision-making process often involved a coin flip and a shrug. Alcohol fueled morale, courage, and occasionally catastrophic mistakes, because nothing says strategic genius like stumbling overboard mid-battle or arguing with your own reflection in a bucket of grog. Grudges were another driver. A slight from last week, a stolen fish, or an insult delivered in poor lighting could spark a full-scale raid, sometimes years after the initial offense, which is like holding on to a grudge long enough to forget why it started, but still being committed to chaos. Planning was optional and usually bad. Maps were smudged, compasses were temperamental, and the idea of coordinated attacks was more like everyone do your own thing and scream loudly. Pirates occasionally came together in brief flashes of brilliance, ambushing convoys, outmaneuvering poorly maintained naval ships. But these moments were as much luck as skill, often described by later storytellers as cunning strategy, when in reality it was mostly a chaotic accident that happened to work out. The combination of rum, rage, and random improvisation made raids unpredictable. Crews could be suddenly heroic or spectacularly useless, depending entirely on how well the sea, stars, and bad decisions aligned. Sometimes battles ended with pirates running out of ammo, dropping their swords, and deciding collectively that retreat was the more stylish option, which basically meant rowing madly away while arguing about who had the better plan in hindsight. Revenge played an oddly motivational role. It wasn't always rational, but it was dramatic, which suited pirates perfectly. If a neighboring captain had embarrassed you last season, expect a highly unnecessary, over-the-top retaliation that looked more like a medieval soap opera than a tactical operation. Casual cruelty and loud boasting were tools of psychological warfare. Pirates would occasionally throw stolen livestock into enemy fortifications or parade their loot on deck while yelling insults that may or may not have been historically accurate. But hey, terror is terror, right? Alcohol ensured that morale stayed high, even when their plan made zero sense and the only coherent strategy involved flailing wildly. Somehow, against all odds, these disasters produced legends, stories of raids that were heroic in retrospect, but basically people screaming, swinging swords, and praying to the ocean for survival. Chroniclers of the era often framed these exploits as cautionary tales, though the pirates probably would have laughed and poured another drink if they survived the night. Every mismanaged assault, drunken brawl, or overzealous revenge attempt reinforced the pirate persona: daring, chaotic, messy, and almost disturbingly effective. It was a world where planning was optional, rage was currency, and a barrel of rum could turn a hopelessly bad situation into a vaguely successful one, or at least provide a funny story for later. And in this environment, medieval pirates thrived, not because they were smart, disciplined, or even sober, but because the combination of bad decisions, grudges, and liquid courage created a feedback loop of chaos that somehow made them legends instead of cautionary failures. Naval warfare in the medieval era often resembled angry boat yoga more than any coherent military strategy, with pirates and sailors flailing, lunging, and balancing in ways that looked like someone had yelled, "Strike a pose," mid-catastrophe. Boarding maneuvers were chaotic choreography. A few pirates would leap with reckless confidence. Some would trip spectacularly on the edge of the deck, and the rest would desperately try to avoid falling overboard, while yelling what might have been instructions but sounded more like existential panic. Cannon fire existed, but was sporadic, inaccurate, and terrifyingly loud, often injuring the people who fired them more than the intended target, which contributed to the general sense that fighting at sea was part battle, part circus, and part hope for the best. Crews adapted to the absurdity. Those who could swing a sword without accidentally decapitating a teammate were celebrated as heroes, while those who failed spectacularly were either left behind or became legends for comedic value. Ships collided, ropes snapped, and sails tore in dramatic fashion, yet somehow the spectacle produced victories, losses, and stories that sounded heroic once retold, because history has a soft spot for chaos that survives. There was an odd rhythm to it. Pirates screamed, waves crashed, splinters flew, and amidst the noise, tiny flashes of tactical brilliance emerged, often by accident. Prowess wasn't just skill, it was improvisation under stress, and sometimes dumb luck carried the day, proving that survival was more about adaptability than any formal understanding of naval tactics. The decks became arenas for ridiculous contests of strength, courage, and sometimes stupidity, where shouting, falling, and bleeding all coexisted in a strangely organized chaos that bewildered enemies and inspired awe in storytellers later. The environment itself was a formidable opponent. Shifting tides, unpredictable winds, and the ever-present threat of sinking reminded every participant that the ocean didn't care who was brave, clever, or loud. It only cared that humans were prone to mistakes. Strategies were fluid and often nonsensical. Lines of attack might collapse mid-charge. Retreats could turn into accidental ambushes, and entire plans might be abandoned simply because someone yelled at the wrong time. Pirates learned quickly that fear, noise, and the sheer spectacle of aggression could often accomplish more than coordinated tactics, making their improvisational style surprisingly effective. Injuries were common, morale fluctuated wildly, and chaos became the operational norm. Yet somehow, this mess of swords, cannon fire, and panicked yelling produced enduring legends, because surviving even half a raid made you worthy of story. In short, medieval naval battles were a messy mix of absurd courage, environmental hostility, and complete lack of decorum, creating a theater of destruction that looked more like a chaotic workout class than organized warfare. Yet somehow, the pirates kept winning, or at least escaping in ways that made them look like heroes in retrospect. The ocean rewarded audacity, laughed at overplanning, and generally kept everyone humble, which is exactly the kind of brutal, chaotic education the medieval pirate thrived on. Pirates versus governments was basically an eternal game of catch me if you can, except the authorities were slow, bureaucratic, and often spectacularly overconfident, while pirates thrived on speed, audacity, and general disregard for rules. Kings, dukes, and city councils would send fleets, issue proclamations, and promise harsh punishments, all while pirates laughed from the safety of a foggy inlet or a conveniently abandoned cove, because enforcement was more paper than action, and paperwork can't swing a cutlass. Attempts to regulate piracy ranged from issuing pardons to dispatching admirals, and often the result was exactly what you'd expect: chaos. Pirates understood the limits of authority instinctively, exploiting slow communication, poorly maintained ships, and officials who preferred grand speeches over actual action. Coastal communities became absurdly familiar with this tug of war. They'd rebuild walls, train militias, and then watch as the same pirates returned next season, probably wearing a hat one villager recognized and waving sarcastically. The legal system had about as much influence at sea as a toddler yelling at a storm cloud, which is to say none, except it did create excellent dramatic material for chroniclers who loved emphasizing the cleverness of pirate escapes. Governments sometimes hired privateers, which was basically outsourcing piracy to people who were technically legal, a concept that sounds smarter than it was in practice because privateers could and did turn rogue whenever it suited them. Bribery, intimidation, and tactical ignorance were standard tools for pirates who would happily negotiate while simultaneously planning the next raid, keeping authorities constantly off balance. Naval campaigns against them were expensive, slow, and fraught with logistical nightmares. Ships needed repair, crews needed feeding, and officials needed someone to blame, all of which left pirates free to enjoy another season of chaos. Historians note that this constant conflict created a weird equilibrium. Governments pretended to control, pirates pretended to fear, and everyone else pretended to understand what was happening, which, in retrospect, was probably the only accurate part of the whole system. Occasionally, a pirate would be captured or executed, which produced more legend than deterrence, because the remaining crews considered their fallen comrade's misfortune a cautionary tale in the "don't get caught" category, not "don't pirate." The game continued across decades: raids, escapes, bribes, and absurdly complicated legal paperwork, all while pirates maintained an air of invincibility and governments maintained an air of authority. The ocean didn't care about titles or proclamations. It only rewarded audacity and adaptability, which is why even poorly organized crews often outmaneuvered fleets that were technically better equipped. In essence, medieval pirates and governments engaged in a ridiculous, endless dance, one side swinging swords and the other swinging pens, and somehow the pirates always looked cooler. This dynamic shaped the mythos we remember today: audacious, lawless, chaotic, and slightly glamorous, though in reality it was mostly a lot of yelling, running, and confusing paperwork. Legends, lies, and looted memories were the final layer of medieval piracy, where fact and exaggeration collided in a fog thicker than any storm at sea, leaving behind stories that sounded cooler than reality ever was. Chroniclers loved to paint pirates as swashbuckling geniuses, capable of feats that probably involved more dumb luck than skill, because everyone enjoys a good tale of improbable heroism over mundane chaos. Tales of buried treasure, terrifying hooks, and secret codes were often invented after the fact, or at least heavily embellished, because a historian's imagination was cheaper than building a functioning navy. Survivors' accounts were inconsistent, depending on how drunk they were, how much they hated the person telling the story, or how good they were at making themselves sound heroic while conveniently omitting the screaming, tripping, and accidental sinking that likely occurred. Villages remembered raids with equal parts terror and resentment, sometimes claiming their town had been wiped out entirely, when in reality a few chickens and barrels of grain had vanished. But wiped out sells better in the annals of history. Pirates themselves contributed to the myth-making, often telling grandiose versions of their exploits around campfires, emphasizing bravery, cunning, and sheer audacity, while strategically leaving out that half the crew had fallen asleep mid-raid or accidentally boarded the wrong ship. Over time, the line between history and legend blurred, creating archetypes: the one-eyed, the hook-handed, the flamboyantly tattooed, that made piracy a fascinating, if messy, cultural phenomenon. Songs, plays, and crude woodcuts amplified these images, translating chaotic, terrifying events into entertainment, which, ironically, made piracy both feared and admired simultaneously. The stories that survived emphasized cleverness, terror, and charisma, while conveniently ignoring the monotony, filth, and constant threat of disease that made life at sea a nightmare more often than an adventure. Scholars later tried to parse truth from myth, but the result was inevitably frustrating. Sources conflicted, exaggerations compounded, and the sea itself kept most answers to itself, which is exactly the kind of environment pirates thrived in. Modern imagination romanticizes them imagining a lifestyle of freedom, daring, and moral ambiguity, but reality was often brutal, messy, and absurdly dangerous, a combination that somehow birthed enduring legends. The memory of medieval piracy persisted because humans love chaos framed as narrative, heroes who barely survived, and villains who were stylish enough to be admired despite their crimes. Each raid, each misadventure, and each overblown tale of bravery or cruelty contributed to a collective memory that was far more entertaining than accurate, ensuring that, centuries later, pirates would live on as symbols of audacity, chaos, and questionable fashion sense. In the end, the stories were less about exact events and more about what people wanted to believe, that someone could seize the impossible, laugh in the face of authority, and leave the world slightly more chaotic than they found it. These legends became the foundation of the pirate mythos we know today, equal parts terror, comedy, and stylish nonsense, and a reminder that history remembers the bold, the loud, and the absurd far more than the boringly competent. Medieval pirates may have been messy, unorganized, and occasionally unlucky, but in the tapestry of memory and myth, they achieved immortality, looting not only goods, but imagination itself.